The Supreme Court has ruled in favor of Donald Trump by temporarily allowing the Trump administration to implement its new asylum rules while the courts decide whether or not this new move by the Trump administration is constitutional. This is likely going to work its way back up to the Supreme Court, but understand that this latest ruling is temporary. It's just meant to allow Trump to do what he wants to do now as this case works its way through the courts. The Supreme Court, in a brief, unsigned order, said the administration may enforce new rules that generally forbid asylum applications from migrants who have traveled through another country on their way to the United States without being denied asylum in that country. So essentially, if you are an asylum seeker and you have to travel through a certain country to get to the United States, under these new rules, you would have to apply for asylum in the country that you're traveling through. And it isn't until you're denied asylum in that country that you can apply for asylum here in the United States. Of course, this is an effort to halt all asylum seekers from Central America, or at least most asylum seekers from Central American countries.
Well, it makes it really inconvenient because as they're working their way up into Mexico, it might take a while for the application process to go through. So presumably they just have to get an Airbnb for like 3 months or something like that, because they have lots of resources and they can afford to just wait around for the government to get back to them.
And also understand that what Mexico is doing is it is trying to prevent asylum seekers from coming into their own country. So they literally have armed members of their military at their southern border to prevent Central Americans from coming into Mexico. Because it essentially puts the onus on the government of Mexico to deal with the asylum seekers, and they don't want to do it. So they're guarding their southern border a little more closely.
They're carrying a lot of our loads here with paying for the wall and now paying for these asylum seekers who actually want to come here. Obviously, that's sarcasm. They're not doing any of that. It's absurd that Trump even wanted that to go through. But just the thing that sticks out to me most is Merrick Garland. This wouldn't be happening if Merrick Garland were on the court, or it would be at least stymied in some sort of way. But we have Neil Gorsuch instead of Merrick Garland, and that all has to do with the obstructionism of the Republicans. So once again, when we hear Nancy Pelosi come out today and say we need a bipartisan agreement before we impeach Donald Trump, a reminder of who we're dealing with on the other side.
It's incredible. It's really incredible. So I want to give you some more details on what the Supreme Court has given Donald Trump during his first term. Just a few months ago in July, the court allowed the administration to begin using $2.5 billion in Pentagon money for the construction of a barrier along the Mexican border. Last year, the court upheld President Trump's ban on travel from several predominantly Muslim countries. Now, there were 2 justices who dissented in this latest Supreme Court decision. Justice Sonia Sotomayor joined Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg in dissenting, saying the court's action will, quote, upend longstanding practices regarding refugees who seek shelter from persecution. Sotomayor wrote that the court's ruling also sidesteps the ordinary judicial process to allow the government to implement a rule that bypassed the ordinary rulemaking process. So what she's saying there is, look, you have an executive branch who is making decisions without going through Congress. We have that branch of government for a reason. These are supposed to be the lawmakers, and Trump is supposed to either veto or sign legislation. But in this case, you have Trump acting unilaterally, and then the Supreme Court, because of how it's now stacked against common sense policy, will protect him and will help to implement those policies even as it's working its way through the federal court system.
Yeah, and the law is incredibly clear. If you're a migrant, you're allowed to apply for asylum. This only subverts the law. That's the point of it. I know that conservatives love to say that it's the letter of the law. We just check. We're textualists. We like to look and see what does it actually say. It's super clear here. But what's equally clear is they have the numbers, and so they can do whatever they want when it comes to these immigration issues. As you pointed out, they're always going to side with them. And so while, again, as you pointed out, it's going to work its way back into the Supreme Court, if you would like to believe that they'll change their mind between now and then, you're free to do so. There's no evidence that that's actually going to happen. And this is going to screw over tons of people. This is literally a life or death issue for many migrants. People will die as a result of this. You could argue that's the entire point, actually. Stop them from coming from the Middle East, screw people coming from Syria, people in Bahamas, you can stay there and die if you want. Even if you're an American citizen in Puerto Rico, we're gonna leave you there to die, we're not gonna help you out at all. wall. Central America, you can stay there and you can die. They call it America first. Of course, at the same time, he's screwing over his own people too. So it's not really America first, it's just definitely middle fingers to everyone else around the world.
That's exactly right. And I do want to read a little more from what Justice Sotomayor wrote in her dissent, because it was strong and she made great points. And unfortunately, we don't have as many thinkers like Justice Sotomayor or Justice Ginsburg in the Supreme Court right now. But she makes such a great point. I mean, look, this is more. Look, it's frustrating, the case itself is frustrating, but it's really more about our system of government and how it's supposed to work and how this really just flies in the face of all of that. She writes, unfortunately, it appears the government has treated this exceptional mechanism as a new normal. Historically, the government has made this kind of request rarely. Now it does so reflexively. She also writes, once again, the executive branch has issued a rule that seeks to upend longstanding practices regarding refugees who seek shelter from persecution. I read that part earlier. Although this nation has long kept its doors open to refugees, and although the stakes for asylum seekers could not be higher, the government implemented its rule without first providing the public notice and inviting the public input generally required by law.
Yeah, of course. And I hope that everyone who thinks that the Supreme Court is this neutral arbiter of laws and that they're just completely put away from, or they're isolated from politics, takes a long look at what's happening right now. We still pretend like these judges are isolated from the political machinations of the day and that they are really just acting as they see the letter of the law and how they read the Constitution and the text and their own judicial philosophy. It's this myth, this American myth that's been going on and on and on for the past few decades, when it's impossible for them to be isolated from politics.
That's
we
right.
have TV, we have the internet, we have news everywhere, every single day. So let's move beyond this myth that just kind of aggrandizes the American system and makes it seem like we're something better than we are. This is the reality. Let's deal with it now. It's a politicized court, as are all the politicized courts, and the as are all the courts. And the Democrats better catch up, because as you look at the lower courts, they're stacked with conservatives. So while the Democrats are still pretending in this old school myth about American exceptionalism, the Republicans are quietly stacking courts with very dangerous conservatives who are doing things under the guise of constitutionalism.
With very little pushback from Chuck Schumer,
right,
which is incredibly frustrating. I mean, he struck a deal with Mitch McConnell when it came to confirming many of these federal judges. And just to buttress your point and reinforce it, the reality is, when it comes to this particular case, an Obama-appointed federal judge struck this new asylum rule down, and then you have a Trump-appointed judge saying, no, it can stand. This is constitutional, I'm fine with it. So yes, there are activist judges, there's no question about it.
They're all activists, both on the left and both on the right, and that's okay, that's the new reality.
Let's just acknowledge it and stop pretending.
Let's move on, because while the liberals are pretending, the Republicans are the ones who are doing the dirty politics per usual.
Yeah, and by the way, Sotomayor said that that they're doing this reflexively now, and you should expect that will become more common, because they have set up an inherently undemocratic but potentially sustainable situation where the executive branch and the Senate are set up in a way that artificially increases the electoral power of Republicans. It's much easier thanks to the Electoral College and the way that the Senate benefits small rural states, that they can control that. That gives them the Supreme Court, by the way, because they have the Senate, and so they have the majority there. So the president can simply make executive orders knowing that the Supreme Court is going to protect him. Taking over the Senate is gonna be incredibly difficult because of the way the system is set up. And even if in the one branch, or one part of one branch in the House where it's not set up in a way that's as easy to manipulate, they're still trying with voter suppression and things like that, gerrymandering, but it's harder. Okay, well then you can take control of that, and we did, but it doesn't matter if the Supreme Court and the executive branch are working hand in hand.
Yeah,
it's not a democracy, it's just not.
The TYT Plus app is now available on iOS and Android. Download to get more TYT content at tyt.com/app.